British East India Company collected its first significant opium revenue from Bengal in 1773. That single administrative act, a colonial monopoly restructured to favor one narcotic crop over all other commercial arrangements in the province, set in motion a financial mechanism that would sustain the British Empire's trade position in Asia for the better part of a century, fund the administration of the Indian subcontinent through its most expensive decades, and eventually precipitate two separate wars fought not over territory or sovereignty in any traditional sense, but over the right to keep a captive market chemically dependent and commercially open to British supply. The standard account of what followed describes the Opium Wars as conflicts born of mercantile pride and imperial ambition, Britain forcing a resistant Chinese empire to accept the principles of free trade against its expressed political will. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. That framing is accurate in outline. What it leaves out is the ledger behind it, the specific revenue figures that colonial administrators tracked with quarterly precision and reported to London in correspondence that was never intended for public examination, the named banking houses that cleared the trade's proceeds across the Pacific and remitted them to British accounts, the governors and commissioners who understood with professional clarity that they were managing a narcotic supply chain at industrial scale on behalf of a government that could not say so openly, and the precise degree to which the entire fiscal architecture of British India depended on that trade continuing without material interruption. The opium revenue was not a byproduct of empire. It was one of its load-bearing walls, and when the wall was threatened, the government of the most powerful state in the world sent warships. To understand how this mechanism was constructed, why it proved so durable across 4 separate administrations and 2 armed conflicts, and why the historical record was shaped around its concealment, the starting point is not China. It is the balance of payments problem that the British East India Company faced from the moment it began trading seriously in Asian markets in the early 17th century. The company wanted Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. British consumers wanted these goods in quantities that grew without interruption through the 18th century, as tea became the defining beverage of British domestic life across every social class, and demand showed no sign of approaching any natural ceiling. By the 1760s, Britain was importing millions of pounds of Chinese tea annually, and the volume was rising year on year. The problem was structural, and it resisted every conventional commercial solution the company attempted. China wanted almost nothing Britain produced. The Chinese imperial court operated on a tribute system that had no commercial logic recognizable to European merchants accustomed to reciprocal exchange of goods. The court did not need British manufactured goods, did not want them in any significant volume, and its communications on the subject made that position clear with a directness that left little room for negotiation. What China would accept in exchange for its exported goods was silver. Silver coin, silver bullion, hard metal that could be weighed and assayed, and that carried no dependency on British commercial credit or manufacturing capacity. And so, for over a century, the trade between Britain and China ran in one direction only. British silver flowed east to pay for Chinese goods, and nothing of equivalent commercial value flowed back in the other direction. The resulting drain on British silver reserves was a chronic structural problem. The company's directors in London could see the mathematics clearly. They had manufactured goods no Chinese market wanted in volume, and a supplier who would accept only hard currency that Britain was steadily running short of supplying. The solution they eventually arrived at was not a product China had requested or expressed any willingness to receive. It was a product China would come to require, whether it chose to or not, through the mechanism of dependency that the company's supply chain was designed to create and sustain. Opium had been present in Chinese life for centuries before the company arrived in any significant commercial volume. It was used medicinally in limited quantities, present in the southern coastal provinces through the regional trade networks of Southeast Asia, unremarkable in its scale and its social impact. What the British East India Company did, systematically and with administrative intention that is visible in the records it kept, was transform a minor regional habit into a mass market dependency, and it accomplished this by controlling the supply chain from agricultural cultivation through processing to export auction with the precision of an industrial enterprise managing a controlled commodity at scale. The company held a monopoly on opium production in Bengal from 1773 onward, the monopoly granted by and coexisting with the colonial administration it had itself established over the preceding decades, through a series of military and commercial maneuvers that had converted the East India Company from a trading firm into the effective government of a subcontinent. It licensed poppy cultivation across the Ganges Plain under contracts that specified acreage allocations, minimum yield requirements, and delivery terms that left the cultivating farmers little practical latitude to grow alternative crops. It operated processing facilities at Patna and Gazipur, where raw opium was collected from farmers, refined to the finished product, compressed into standardized balls of uniform weight, packed into wooden chests of known quantity, and held in company warehouses until the auction season. The chests were sold at public auction in Calcutta to licensed private traders who then carried the product aboard their own vessels to the Chinese coast. The company itself did not formally sell opium into China. That was a legal fiction maintained with care and consistency across the period. The fiction insulated the company from direct culpability under the terms of its own parliamentary charter, which prohibited it from certain forms of direct commercial engagement, while ensuring that every chest of Bengal opium that reached Chinese waters had passed through company-licensed production, company-administered processing, and company-run auction, generating revenue at every stage of the supply chain. By 1800, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 chests of Bengal opium were being exported to China annually. By 1820, the figure had climbed to 10,000 chests. By 1830, it stood at approximately 30,000, with each chest containing roughly 140 pounds of prepared opium. The scale of human dependency this volume of consumption implied was not a figure that appeared in the company's annual reports submitted to Parliament. What appeared instead was the revenue line, and that revenue line was, by the 1830s, the single largest source of commercial income the company collected across its entire Asian operation, exceeding by a substantial margin the revenues it derived from any other single commodity or trade route. The opium revenue funded the administration of British India in terms that colonial administrators understood with precision and discussed in internal correspondence with a candor they were careful to keep away from parliamentary scrutiny or press circulation. It paid the salaries of the Indian civil service, maintained the company's military establishment across a subcontinent that required constant garrisoning and periodic military campaigns to hold, financed the wars of territorial expansion that extended British control from Bengal westward and southward, and covered the administrative costs of governing a territory of continental scale from a headquarters that was months away from the government in London by any available means of communication. The Indian territorial revenues collected through the land tax, which the company administered through a complex system of local settlements negotiated with landlords and village communities across different regions under different terms, were substantial in absolute terms, but structurally insufficient to cover the full and expanding cost of the colonial apparatus, as that apparatus grew with territorial acquisition. Opium filled the gap in the accounts. Without the auction revenues at Calcutta, the company's Indian operation ran at a deficit that the Court of Directors was not prepared to absorb from English commercial capital, and that the British Treasury would not subsidize from public revenue at a scale the parliamentary arithmetic would have tolerated. The dependency ran in both directions. The company needed the opium revenue to balance its Indian accounts, and the Indian accounts needed to balance for the company to justify its continued existence to Parliament as a commercially viable entity rather than a permanent drain on the public purse. Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of Bengal, who oversaw the initial formal restructuring of the monopoly arrangements in 1773, wrote in private correspondence that the trade was an evil he found difficult to countenance in principle, but that the company's financial position did not allow its abandonment. The formulation captures the institutional logic that governed the trade's maintenance across the following 7 decades with precision, a moral position held simultaneously with an institutional decision that violated it, with the institutional argument assigned priority, and the moral reservation preserved in private correspondence, where it would inform the historical record without embarrassing the public one. Every Governor-General who administered the opium revenue after Hastings operated within the same structure. The moral reservation was expressed privately and regularly. The revenue was collected and the auctions were held. The men who executed the trade at its commercial end were identifiable, and they were not operating at the margins of respectable commercial life. The firm of Jardine, Matheson and Company, established in Canton in 1832 by William Jardine and James Matheson, both former servants of the East India Company's commercial networks who had remained in Asia after their company service to trade on private account, became the dominant private trading house in the opium commerce between Bengal and the Chinese coast. They were not peripheral figures in colonial commerce. Jardine maintained working relationships with the colonial administration in Calcutta, with the Board of Control in London that supervised the company's activities under parliamentary authority, and with members of Parliament whom he engaged with specific attention to their capacity to influence policy on the China trade question. The firm's correspondence, substantial portions of which survive in the Jardine Matheson archive held at Cambridge University Library, preserves the operational detail of the trade in specific terms: shipment volumes season by season, price negotiations with Chinese merchant intermediaries at the coastal receiving stations, calculations of the payments made to local Chinese officials who facilitated the onward movement of goods from the offshore anchorages into the interior, and the currency conversion mechanisms that translated opium proceeds held in Chinese silver into bills of exchange redeemable in London through the commercial banking networks of the city. When the Chinese imperial government moved decisively to suppress the trade in 1838 and appointed Lin Zexu as Imperial Commissioner with authority to act, it was Jardine who traveled to London in the winter of that year and engaged Lord Palmerston, then Foreign Secretary, in a series of meetings whose substance can be partially reconstructed from the Foreign Office records and from Jardine's own archived correspondence. Jardine provided Palmerston with operational intelligence on the geography of the Chinese coast, recommended specific harbor locations as objectives for naval demonstration, identified the points in Chinese coastal defense most susceptible to pressure from a naval force of the kind Britain could readily assemble, and argued the commercial and fiscal case for a swift military expedition that would restore trading access before the disruption to the next shipping season became commercially irreversible. Palmerston took the advice with a dispatch that reflected how completely the government's calculations aligned with the commercial interests Jardine was representing in those meetings. The Chinese imperial court had understood what the trade was doing to its fiscal position for longer than is sometimes acknowledged. Emperor Daoguang, who came to the throne in 1820, inherited a trade dynamic that had reversed its direction within the preceding 2 decades, in ways that were visible in the silver accounts of every Chinese provincial administration. Where silver had once flowed from Britain and Europe into China as payment for the tea, silk, and porcelain that Chinese workshops produced for export, it was now flowing outward in volume, drained by Chinese buyers at every level of the social hierarchy who depleted household and commercial silver reserves to purchase a product the imperial government had formally prohibited since 1729. The prohibition of 1729 had not stopped the trade. What it had produced instead was a distribution network operating through bribable local officials and coastal intermediaries whose systematic susceptibility to payment the British traders had identified early and exploited as a routine cost of conducting business in the coastal provinces. By the 1830s, Daoguang's administration estimated that somewhere between 2 million and 10 million Chinese subjects were dependent on regular opium consumption, with the highest concentrations in the coastal provinces where access to imported product from the offshore receiving stations had been easiest and most continuous. The silver outflow was measurable in terms that the imperial treasury tracked and that had direct fiscal consequences. The imperial government was losing specie at a rate that undermined its capacity to collect taxes and to pay its military forces on terms that maintained discipline, since rural tax assessments were denominated in silver while peasants earned their agricultural incomes in copper cash, and the rising exchange rate of silver against copper, driven in part by the silver drain that opium imports were producing, was translating into effective tax increases that no deliberate policy had imposed but that the monetary consequences of the trade were generating automatically across the agricultural economy. In 1838, Daoguang appointed Lin Zexu as Imperial Commissioner at Canton, with specific and explicit authority to end the opium trade permanently and by whatever means were necessary. Lin's approach was thorough and documented. He required the foreign merchants trading at Canton to surrender their entire stock of opium held in the offshore warehouses and at the Canton factories. The surrender produced approximately 20,283 chests of Bengal opium. Lin had this entire consignment destroyed at Humen over a period of 23 days, dissolving it in trenches of salt water mixed with lime and flushing the result into the sea at low tide. He also wrote to Queen Victoria directly, in a letter composed with the evident expectation that it would be taken seriously as a diplomatic communication. Lin asked by what moral principle a nation that had made opium illegal within its own national territory and prohibited its consumption among its own population conducted a trade in that product into a country whose government had prohibited it by law, and he asked what Queen Victoria's government would say if China sent vessels to deliver harmful commodities into British ports in violation of British law. The letter survives in the Chinese imperial records. The British government's formal response was not an answer to the letter's argument, it was a naval expedition. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The First Opium War ran from 1839 through 1842. The disparity in military technology and organizational capacity between British naval forces and the Chinese coastal defense meant the military outcome was not in serious doubt at any stage of the conflict. The Treaty of Nanking, concluded in August of 1842, required China to cede Hong Kong Island to the British Crown in perpetuity, to open 5 coastal cities to British residents, and trade under conditions that gave British subjects significant commercial and legal privileges, and to pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, the largest sum any foreign power had succeeded in extracting from the Chinese state to that point in history. The indemnity was structured to cover British war costs and to compensate British merchants for the value of the opium that Lin Zexu had confiscated and destroyed. China was required, under the formal terms of an internationally negotiated treaty, to pay Britain for the destruction of a product that Britain had been supplying into China in systematic violation of Chinese law across the preceding 4 decades. The indemnity was set in installments over a defined schedule, and the installments were secured against Chinese customs revenues, which meant that the Chinese imperial government's ability to collect and deploy its trade duties was partially pledged to servicing a debt incurred in a war that had been fought over the right of British traders to continue a trade the Chinese government had tried to suppress. The Treaty of Nanking did not contain a clause legalizing opium imports. That omission was the product of deliberate calculation and not of oversight. Legalizing opium in the treaty text would have made the British government's position in the parliamentary debate that followed the war indefensible. The opposition the war had attracted had already been substantial. Gladstone had spoken against it in terms that the opposition press had amplified. The government needed a settlement it could present as a vindication of free trade principles and British commercial rights, not as a narcotics concession extracted at gunpoint. The practical consequence of leaving opium outside the treaty text was that the trade resumed after Nanking at a scale and through precisely the mechanisms that had operated before the crisis, protected now by the extraterritorial rights the treaty granted to British subjects in China and by the treaty port infrastructure that made coastal distribution easier than the offshore warehouse system it partially replaced. The Second Opium War, fought between 1856 and 1860 with the French government as Britain's military partner, was triggered by an incident whose original facts were disputed from the first day. A vessel called the Arrow, flying a colonial flag under a British license that Chinese port records suggest had already lapsed at the time of the incident, was boarded by Chinese officials at Canton who removed crew members suspected of involvement in piracy. The British consul at Canton declared the boarding a violation of British flag rights. Whether the declaration was made in honest belief or in the knowledge that it would serve as a casus belli for an expedition that commercial and political interests in Britain were already disposed toward, the available correspondence does not conclusively resolve. The military expedition that followed was conducted at a scale that reflected its objectives clearly. Canton was occupied. The Imperial Summer Palace outside Peking, containing irreplaceable collections of art and historical material accumulated across multiple dynasties, was deliberately destroyed and looted by British and French forces on the order of the British commander as a punitive demonstration. The Xianfeng Emperor fled the capital. The Treaty of Tientsin that concluded the conflict legalized opium imports into China explicitly, subject to a tariff of 30 taels per chest. 11 additional Chinese ports were opened to foreign commerce and residents. Freedom of movement was guaranteed for foreign Christian missionaries across the Chinese interior. And China was required to pay indemnities to Britain and France combined, totaling 16 million taels of silver. The legalization clause was the commercial and fiscal objective. The entire sequence of events from 1838 through 1860 had been structurally directed toward producing. Once opium was legally imported and taxed, the Chinese imperial government collected a percentage of its customs revenue from the trade. The government that had twice gone to war to stop the trade was now receiving a financial stake in its continuation. The mechanism by which an imperial administration was converted from the trade's most determined institutional opponent into one of its revenue beneficiaries is the most precisely engineered element in the entire structure. The banking infrastructure that consolidated around the post-treaty trade took its most significant institutional form in 1865 with the establishment of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. Its founding shareholders included Jardine, Matheson and Company, alongside the principal agency houses whose commercial operations in Asia had been built substantially on the proceeds of the legal and pre-legal opium commerce and the broader treaty port trade it had opened. The bank was constituted under a Hong Kong colonial ordinance, headquartered in the territory Britain had acquired as the first territorial consequence of the first war it had fought, to preserve the trade's access to the Chinese market. It issued its own banknotes in Hong Kong and Shanghai, held the accounts of the colonial administration in Hong Kong, cleared the proceeds of the legal import trade the Tientsin settlement had created, and financed the movement of goods across Asian shipping routes. The Customs Administration that Robert Hart ran as Inspector General of the Imperial Maritime Customs from 1863, staffed substantially by British and other foreign officials while formally operating in the name of the Chinese imperial government, collected the duties on legal opium imports and remitted the Chinese government's share while simultaneously administering the repayment of Chinese indemnity obligations to foreign powers, obligations secured against those same customs revenues. The institution that would, through a sequence of 20th century restructurings, become HSBC, had at its commercial origin the function of being the principal settlement bank of a trade that 2 military expeditions had been required to make and keep legal. The domestic political opposition to the trade in Britain through the latter half of the 19th century was real, and it was sustained, and the way it was managed is part of the record. The Society for the Suppression of the Opium Trade, founded in 1874 with support from Quaker communities, nonconformist religious networks, and a segment of liberal parliamentary opinion, produced sustained pressure through petitions, parliamentary questions, and public campaigns across 2 decades. In 1891, a House of Commons motion condemning the trade as morally indefensible passed with a majority. The government of the day noted the resolution and did not implement it. The Indian administration communicated to London in terms whose financial specificity was unambiguous that the opium revenue remained essential to Indian colonial finances and that its elimination without equivalent replacement through new taxation or metropolitan subsidy was not a viable proposition. A Royal Commission on Opium was appointed in 1893, with a composition that the abolition societies immediately challenged on grounds of conflict of interest. The commission produced a report in 1895 concluding that the trade caused no serious harm to Indian or Chinese populations and that fiscal suppression was unwarranted. The abolitionists documented with care and precision the witnesses the commission had declined to hear and the evidence it had set aside. The report served its purpose of deferring further legislative action and was published in the Parliamentary Papers of 1895, where the commission's methodology and the challenges to it are both preserved for any reader patient enough to work through the volume. The trade's end came from the direction its institutional supporters had not prepared for. Domestic Chinese opium cultivation, which had expanded through the final decades of the 19th century with the implicit tolerance of provincial administrations, and eventually with the explicit accommodation of the imperial government itself, had by the early 1900s produced Chinese-grown product in volume sufficient to compete directly on price with the imported Indian supply across most of the markets that had previously depended on Bengal opium. The commercial logic that had constructed and sustained the trade, that China's silver would continue to flow to Bengal opium producers because no alternative supply existed at comparable quality and price, was being dissolved by Chinese agricultural expansion into the poppy cultivation that Indian farmers had previously supplied alone. The Anglo-Chinese Agreement of 1907 committed the British government to 10% annual reductions in Indian opium exports to China, contingent on demonstrated Chinese reductions in domestic cultivation. The Indian administration accepted these terms in part because the revenue arithmetic had shifted sufficiently that the commitment was financially absorbable. Alternative tax structures developed through the preceding decades of colonial administration had moderated the absolute dependency on opium revenue that had characterized the company period. The trade that had required 2 wars to keep open was terminated in 1917 without producing the fiscal crisis that its institutional defenders had for decades cited as the reason it could not be stopped. The sequence of causation runs in that direction. The trade ended when the financial model that required it had changed enough that continuation was commercially dispensable before it became politically mandatory. The parliamentary record of the 1890s preserves a specific quality of institutional management that deserves attention as a document of how commercial dependencies shape official responses to moral challenges. The House of Commons motion of 1891 that condemned the opium trade was not a close vote. It passed with a majority sufficient to make its political meaning clear. The Gladstonian liberal tradition that had opposed the First Opium War from the floor of the Commons 50 years earlier had matured into an organized parliamentary bloc with genuine popular backing from nonconformist constituencies across the Midlands and the North. The government's response was not confrontation, it was procedure. A royal commission takes time to appoint, time to conduct hearings, time to produce a report, and time for any response to that report to work through the parliamentary calendar. The Commission's 1895 report bought the government 5 additional years of undisturbed revenue collection. The technique was not unique to the opium question. It was the standard instrument for managing inconvenient majorities on questions where the institutional stakes were high enough to justify the political cost of being seen to act while not acting. What made the Opium Commission distinctive was the degree to which its methodology was documented by its critics at the time, and is therefore available now. The India Office correspondence relating to the Commission's establishment and the Abolition Society's contemporaneous analysis of the Commission's composition and procedures are both present in the archival record. They have not been suppressed. They were produced by official and quasi-official bodies, and they sit in institutional archives where any researcher with appropriate access can read them. The suppression they represent is not archival. It is the suppression of historical prominence, the decision, made implicitly by the weight of conventional historical framing, that these documents belong to specialist literature rather than to the general account of how the British Empire managed one of its most significant revenue streams across the period of its greatest territorial extent. The China that emerged from the period of the Opium Wars carried in its institutional memory and its economic structure the marks of the mechanism that had operated against it for a century. The treaty port system that Nanking established and Tientsin extended created within Chinese territory a network of zones where foreign commercial law, foreign property rights, and foreign personal jurisdiction applied in ways that Chinese courts and Chinese officials could not reach. These zones attracted foreign capital, foreign commercial infrastructure, and the Chinese commercial intermediaries who serviced foreign trade, and they created within Chinese cities dual economic environments in which the conditions applicable to Chinese citizens and those applicable to foreign residents were governed by different legal systems operating in physical proximity. The effect on Chinese economic development across the final decades of the Qing dynasty and into the Republican period was not incidental to the treaty port structure. It was an expression of how that structure had been designed to function. The Jardine Matheson firm continued to operate in Asia through the 20th century under successive restructurings of its corporate form, present in Hong Kong under British administration and eventually under Chinese sovereignty after 1997. Its institutional continuity, spanning the full arc from the Opium Clipper era through the period of treaty port commerce and into the post-colonial economy of modern Hong Kong. The firm's current operations do not include narcotics. They include property development, retail, financial services, and infrastructure management across Asian markets. The lineage from the 1830s to the present is unbroken in corporate terms and is acknowledged in the firm's own institutional history, which describes the 19th century origins without dwelling on the specific character of the commerce that generated the capital base on which the subsequent business was constructed. The financial thread that the mechanism created did not dissolve when the trade was formally ended. The banking institution founded to service the treaty port commerce expanded through the 20th century through a sequence of corporate restructurings that preserved the balance sheet and the institutional lineage while the commercial environment around it changed. The indemnity obligations imposed on China through the Nanking and Tientsin settlements, and the substantially larger Boxer Protocol indemnity of 1901, requiring payment of 450 million taels of silver over 39 years to a consortium of 8 foreign powers, shaped Chinese public finances through the Republican period and created debt structures that successive Chinese governments spent decades attempting to renegotiate and redeem. Hong Kong remained a British colonial possession until 1997, the enduring territorial artifact of what the First War had extracted. The revenue architecture inherited by independent India in 1947 carried in its structure the priorities of a colonial fiscal system designed around extraction and the maintenance of commercial advantage rather than developmental investment. The mechanism Warren Hastings restructured in 1773 to resolve a balance of payments problem produced consequences that closed, where they have closed at all, within living memory. The opium trade was presented to the British public, when it was addressed at all, as a matter of free trade principle and Chinese resistance to commercial modernity. The financial record shows it was a question of colonial fiscal necessity, expressed in commercial language, sustained twice by military force when commercial leverage proved insufficient, and managed through institutional arrangements designed at every stage to make its continuation appear technically inevitable until the financial model that required it had quietly changed. The ledger behind the official account ran for 144 years. It was never meant to be the history. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.